Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at Junction Reads. I am thrilled, absolutely beyond thrilled, that Catherine Graham is joining us today with her new novel, The Most Cunning Heart, from Palimpsest Press. Before we officially get started, I'm going to acknowledge the land. Catherine, Kaylee, and I are all three of us in Toronto. If you would like to acknowledge where you're joining us from, please feel free to put it in the chat. I am sitting in Toronto, which for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Wyandot Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. It is still home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we are very grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on their territory. Catherine Graham, welcome back to Junction Reads.
Thank you.
Before everybody joined us, we talked about how it feels like decades since we were in person at one of our events, but I so appreciate you coming back with your second novel, which also so happens to be a sequel to Quarry, which we had at Junction Reads previously. Before we hear your reading, I would love to steal some ideas on what to add to my TBR pile and ask who you're reading right now.
Yeah. Well, it's a big question because I read a lot at once, not at the same moment, but I'll have stacks here and I dip in here. But I thought, okay, I'm going to focus. And this book actually is connected to something that I'm also part of. I lead the book club at the Toronto International Festival of Authors, and this is our December book, Raleigh Hodge's Stray Dog. So that is actually what I'm really truly reading right now, so there you go. But there are many books scattered around the house and dipping in and out and so on, so yeah.
Nice, that's great. And do you get is it an author a month, or do you have more than one author at
one a month? Yeah, although I have to say, when we started, I guess in September, we had two, because we were starting an early September, and then we had another one, and then they had their festival. So I have to pace. I was doing some interviews too, which was lovely. As you know, it's interesting because I've been on the other side prepping as you are, Alice, and I'm sure as a wonderful interviewer. So the time I know that goes into that, and then I think about, oh, I know what I have to read, but I don't have to prepare in the same way. So it's interesting being on the other side for a moment again too. But yeah, and then in October, I guess we had one book. And then it evens out, and then we'll start again next year. Usually in February we start, so we have like a half season, then a break in the summer, and then we continue in the fall.
Nice. And the By the Lake Book Club, which happens to be right across the street from my house.
Oh, is that how close you are to Humber? Wow.
Right. Literally, I could throw, well,
yeah,
if I could throw. Can't throw. If I could throw, I could throw a ball at Assembly Hall.
Yeah.
And do you interview with By the Lake every
season? Yeah. So I interviewed there with Linda Fay-Rue, well, I guess that was last month, and yeah, I've been doing that for a few years now too, and I thoroughly enjoy that. Yeah,
that's great. And Jesse Wenty's coming there in December, and
yeah, they always have such a rich lineup. And actually, we did Jesse's previous book at TIFA in our book club, and because we were Zooming then with the transition after COVID, it's been lovely because authors then have been able to visit us as well, much like the setting that we're in right now. So we can have the discussion, and then the author can come in as well. So that's been great, despite the sort of challenges that COVID continues to bring our way. That it's nice sometimes when it makes for people gathering in different ways, but in ways that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Yeah.
That's awesome. So I am going to share your biography before you read, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And just to let everybody know, following Catherine's reading, I'm going to ask some questions just to kickstart the conversation. Feel free to put some questions in the chat for Kaylee, and she'll ask on your behalf at some point in that the Q&A portion. Catherine Graham is the author of 7 acclaimed poetry collections and 2 novels. Her debut novel, Quarry, won the Miramichi's Readers the Very Best Book Award and an Independent Publisher Book Awards Gold Medal for fiction. Her poetry collection, Ether, an Out-of-Body Lyric, was a finalist for the Toronto Book Award. The Celery Forest was a CBC Best Book of the Year and finalist for the Fred Cogswell Award for Excellence in Poetry. Her Red Hair Rises with the Wings of Insects was a finalist for the Raymond Souster Award and a CAA Poetry Award. Her poetry is anthologized and published in the Field Day Anthology of Irish Writing, Volume 4 and 5, and the White Page. I think it's Bhiliog Van, 20th Century Irish Women Poets, and various literary journals, including Joyland, Poetry Daily, Poetry Ireland Review, Gutter Magazine, The London Reader, Arc Poetry Magazine, Exile Magazine, The Ulster Tatler, and so many more. She teaches creative writing at the University of Toronto and leads, as we mentioned, a monthly book club at the Toronto International Festival of Authors and interviews for the By the Lake Book Club down here in Etobicoke. Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Thank you so much. I feel I've been made so welcome even prior to this with all of the lovely shares that you do for authors. And also I'd like to thank Kaylee and also Sarah. I mean, you make a wonderful team, and grateful for these opportunities to connect with you too. So thank you very much for all you do.
Thank you. Thanks.
So I'm going to read a little bit now from The Most Cunning Heart. And it takes us back to the 90s, pre-social media, takes us to Northern Ireland, and it takes us to the character Caitlin Maharg, and she's dealing with grief and loss, but she's interested in poetry, and she's there to pursue it. And she's living by the Irish Sea and very isolated place, so she relies on other people to get around, including to towns to get her groceries, which they call messages in the UK. And so I'm just going to jump into a scene where she's with her landlady, Mrs. Petty, and we'll move into that now. I was quiet on the drive to Larne. The morning rain had ceased, but the sky was low and misty. Little rain beads clung to the stillness of things, like oval birds hanging upside down on wires and branches. They jeweled the hedgerows with sunlight that wasn't there. Mrs. Petty was slick with her stick shift. She used it like an extension of her wiry body. She lived alone in the farmhouse that faced land, not water, despite the stunning sea view. On a clear day, you could see Scotland, the Mull of Kintyre. My mother's side came from the Isle of Mull. They left everything they knew to farm the craggy fields near Owen Sound. The sea held liquid beauty, but land was the prized possession. Water was for traffic. It couldn't be claimed, parceled out, divided. I'd witnessed the soldiers roaming the streets of Belfast, my one visit there since my arrival. Dressed in army fatigues and carrying rifles, manning armored tanks. Once inside the gated city center, from Boots to Marks and Spencer's, security guards stood at doorways, demanding with a casual nod of the head, all incoming shoppers open their bags and purses for inspection. Would it be that easy to find a bomb, I wondered? Despite the hostility of these daily intrusions, locals took them with ease. They had become a way of life. Mrs. Petty was a widow now, and her children grown. They've gone away to America, she told me. One East Coast, one West. Makes for a challenge with visits, I tell you. That's why I have them come here. She ran the farm with the help of hired men. No cattle or horses, just sheep. Chickens clucked around the gravel driveway. I'd seen her tossing them feed. She was always doing something. Stop, and that's when the mischief comes in. So I knew she didn't believe in poetry. She was a businesswoman underneath that housewife demeanor. She liked that I paid a good sum for rent. Having the House of Poets here on Isla McGee, an island that wasn't an island, provided a nice supplement to her tidy income. Welcome to Loyalist Larne, read the sign on a brick wall. The image of a man with long curly white hair, sitting on an upright horse as if ready to charge into fight, was saturated with primary colors, in-your-face colors. That's King Billy, she said. I looked down at the curbstones painted in patterns of red and bright blue. No orange and green here, she said proudly. You mean no Catholics, I wanted to say. Mrs. Petty, like most residents of Island McGee, except Benny and Janet, went to church on Sundays, Presbyterian like Nana Florence's church in Owen Sound. God was something to fight over, claim. I looked up. Rays of light poked through the clouds like strings from an instrument. But who was playing home? Good fences make good neighbors, wrote Frost, but that only worked when both sides were content with their territory. Power was king, not God. More was better always. I thought of a dog marking its territory with drips of blue and red paint, the visual stench of it. Beware, you're not wanted here. Who was King Billy? Goes back to 1690, the Battle of the Boyne. She turned into a parking lot and headed to a block of tall elms. My secret spot, she said, switching off the engine. I waited for her to say more, but she didn't. She pulled some thick plastic bags out of the boot and saw me eyeing them. To put the messages in, she handed me one. Messages meant groceries. I knew that now. The meaning had revealed itself finally. I was learning to wait for the revelation of things. Patience and timing, Mom used to say, sewing quilts and crafts in her corner nook. To ask was to admit weakness, vulnerability. I didn't want Mrs. Petty to know what I didn't. I decided not to go to the co-op first. I didn't want her eyeing my messages. I went to the drugstore instead, the chemist, to buy toiletries and tampons. The shelves are crammed with brand names I didn't recognize, but eventually I found what I needed. Outside the shop, I was about to turn right, but something pulled me the other way. I headed through a low-lit tunnel, and once through the narrowing passageway, I discovered kiosks selling items not found in bigger shops. Candles, knickknacks, crafts. The one selling jewelry caught my eye. The pieces on display were modern and stylish with an uncanny quality, as if I'd seen them before. But where? I fingered a heart-shaped necklace, and while doing so, I realized it wasn't one heart, but three. They were layered like plates, small, medium, and large, joined by a knotted black cord. Tiny holes were drilled into each to link them as one. Pink, then blue, and the largest, slate gray, was almost black. Feel free to try it on, said the store clerk. Her blonde hair was bunched on top of her head like cotton candy. I could feel its stickiness like heat. She held up an oval mirror. I slipped the knotted black cord over my head. The hearts were cold on my skin, a soft clacking when I let go. Little Ness, I said, gazing at my reflection. For a moment, I forgot she was there. I usually avoided trying things on in public. I needed to hide, to see. It's the only one, and oh, it looks brilliant on you. Where are you from? Canada. You seem too nice. I smiled. I'll take it. She tucked the necklace into a small brown bag. Enjoy the Trinity, she said. On the drive back to Island McGee, I noticed a solitary tree in the middle of a field. A pile of stones surrounded its base. It's a fairy tree, Mrs. Petty said. A what? It's for the wee folk. Many believe in them, can't say I do, but don't ask me to be the one to chop it down. The wee folk. Ah, wee. A wee cup of tea. But the amount was the same below the rim. What's there to believe? I was curious to know the magic. It's the entrance to the other world. To cut down a fairy tree is to bring bad luck. Even to touch one, well, why would you want to go and touch a tree in a field unless you're a bit daft? It doesn't seem practical leaving it there. The people of Island McGee, Protestants from what I could tell, were the no-nonsense type. Clearly some superstitions lingered. Andy Evans wrote about them, or was it Benny? Maybe both. It's the real estate of the poet, if you ask me. Fairies. Off with the fairies, I'd heard people say, rolling their eyes. That fancy car manufacturer, DeLorean, chopped one down outside Belfast to build his automobile factory. She smirked. The place didn't last, brought on his own demise, so we did. It's hawthorn, right? We had them at the quarry. Springtime, they'd blossom pure white, but the branches were studded with thorns. I had to dodge them while cutting grass with Dad's push lawnmower. Sometimes a miscalculation led to scrapes. I've touched them, I said. She pulled into the gravel driveway and looked at me. Well, aren't you the one then?
Thank you so much. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
In reading The Most Cunning Heart, it struck me. I had this opinion about the difference between poetry and prose, and that poetry is or can be a more emotional language, and that prose is more of a visual language. But in reading this, and I guess it's because you're an incredible poet, The Most Cunning Heart does both. Everything is so laden with imagery, but also with so much emotion. And I wanted to talk to you, this is probably an obvious question, but about the differences between sitting down and writing prose and writing poetry.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting because there's an urge to write, and then you write, and then what happens tells you what it wants to be. And I didn't even know I was writing a poem when I first, I guess, wrote one, because I was going back to, there's some parallels between Caitlin and myself, although Caitlin is a fictional character, but she's dealing with grief and the loss of her parents, and that's what happened to me. So I had no plans to ever be a writer. It still amazes me when I hear the bio and think, have I written that many books? Oh my goodness, I still feel like a beginner. And I mean that sincerely. You're facing the blank page and you're in the unknown. And it's a constant thing about dealing with the unknown, which is a life thing as well, too, not only a writing thing. But going back to grief, a worried friend suggested that I see a therapist. I was very introverted and didn't know how to deal with grief, and my peers couldn't relate to me. So the therapist was wonderfully helpful and suggested that I keep a journal to sort of write out my thoughts and feelings and try and make sense of the losses, which you can't really make sense of, but at least you're expressing and getting something out and having some relationship with the grief outside of yourself. And one day I went into this sort of portal and I started playing with imagery, language, didn't know what I was doing, but I knew it was different than just writing out what I was feeling. And I shared it with a friend, a family friend, and she said, you're writing poetry. These are poems. So it had to take someone else to tell me what I was doing, because I had no concept that I myself could ever participate in such an endeavor. Although I did well in English, I knew what a poem was. No harm to men with beards, but they were all by dead men with beards.
Yeah.
And so it was there were no models. I didn't know of Sylvia Plath even at that stage. So, you know, these female writers who've been so important to me, so many writers, not just the female, but male too. But that's a whole other story. But going back to that, it was through that I realized, oh, this is poetry. This is what I'm doing. So I wanted to learn the craft, and I'm still learning the craft. It's an ongoing thing. So that was what I first started writing, and that was what I first started publishing. But all along the way, there were things that sort of came out in different sort of shapes, and sort of like, I guess in some ways, I guess it was prose. They were little paragraphs, they were little vignettes. It wasn't poetry. And then I realized that, oh, this is something else. And then I realized through these little vignettes, and then I started to make them bigger, and then into scenes, and then into chapters. And that became Quarry, the book that you mentioned earlier. And then from Quarry came this book, The Most Cunning Heart. And it's interesting, you know, it's lovely that you're connecting it to Quarry, and I love that, because there is that connection. But I also wanted to write it as a standalone. And I know from other readers who haven't read Quarry or don't even know about Quarry, that they feel it's its own thing. So I appreciate that. To me, that's also very much like the Quarry, in that there's so many layers of sedimentary rock. And I think about stories having so many layers. And I think that they're both separate, but at the same time, they're connected. And I have found in some ways that all my writing has been connected. Like when I go back to one book, then I see there's a little thread that connects to the next, and so on. And there was no plan along the way, but I realized that's how my creative process is and continues to be. So it's an interesting way that in finding what you write, then finding the form through the writing. And so that's really how I have found. And then an interesting thing happened actually with the book Ether, an out-of-body lyric, because it was a hybrid. So it was almost like, here's the poems that I've written for many years, here's the novels, and here's this in between. So I couldn't have written Ether without those independent journeys. And so then it was interesting to see that this natural sort of combination that resulted in these two sort of threading together to become its own thing. So I find that not only does the subject matter choose you, the form chooses me as well. So it's that sort of finding its way, and what's the best way to tell the story, to tell the poem, to tell the experience that you're trying to do with language. So does that answer your question, or
It does.
Even go anywhere with that?
It does. And fortunately or unfortunately, it answers all of my other questions too.
Oh, Allison, I know that as an interviewer, I've had that moment where I'm like, oh my goodness, they've just like, and then I have to like go in free fall and think, okay, where am I going to go with that now?
Well, no, for a second there, I was like, oh my God, is she reading my mind? Is it like some kind of weird? No, and that's it exactly. Like what you said about you're writing from your own experiences, and that old adage of write what you know. And in reading, and not necessarily Corey, because I agree with you. I have a question about sequels too, but in that writing what you know and having this book be so emotionally jammed with not just the crappy relationship with Andy, but in the grief and the loss and her reconciling her relationship with her Nana. How challenging is that? It, like when the form presents itself, when the story presents itself, and you realize it is in some way an exercise of your own heart.
Yeah.
How do you attend to that? How do you attend to yourself as writer while you're writing that?
Yeah. Well, again, I think there's something really interesting about the way we not only write, but work in ways to find when we can write certain subject matters.
Yeah.
When I think going back to my journey, I did go to Northern Ireland, so I did live there. So that's a connection too that I have with Caitlin. And when I think about that, because that was when I was directly connecting to poetry, but I didn't have any sort of skill set, craft. So I went there to study. And because it was in the 90s, it was, again, no social media. So I was very heavily influenced by Northern Irish poets, UK poets. The only Canadians you would see in Waterstones in Belfast were Michael Ondaatje and Margaret Atwood. And not to say they're not wonderful poets, but I didn't have any connection to Canadian poets, even though I was Canadian. So then when I came back, it was really interesting to sort of find out what was happening here. So again, I feel like that way, it's also like a hybrid sort of thing. But in terms of going to Northern Ireland, when I think about my heart, I think that makes sense. I needed to get away from the familiar to write about what I needed to write about, so that there was a freeing element, because nobody knew my parents there. Nobody knew me at one point either. So it was freeing to write about them. And then I realized in the writing about them, I was having a relationship with them. And I continue to have a relationship with them, which is fascinating. And for those, I mean, that's part of life. We live life, but we also experience loss. And I'm sure many of the participants have stories too about loss and maybe be going something tragic right at this particular moment. But in that way too, when you realize that in that loss, at least for me, and I know from others that I've talked to, the relationship with the dead person does continue. There's an ongoingness. And I think for artists, not just writers, but artists who want to move in that realm, there's a natural instinct to try and, I don't know, make sense. The person's gone, but to somehow keep the essence of who they are. And as you keep learning about them, that essence can unfold into new ways of working with the material. Because I know for myself now, I'm older than both my parents. So I have reached that age of living past their lives. And I can't believe that. So that's added a whole other, I don't even know if I can write about that, but anyway, but I know I'm processing that. So, and then when I think about my mother, Ether's about a cancer journey that I experienced, and I was diagnosed with breast cancer the same age she was when she died of the disease. So she accompanied me on that journey. And as you know, Allison, there's a mother figure who's very much part of Caitlin's life. And so I'm very interested in those intimate relationships and the intimacy that can continue when someone is no longer there in the physical presence, but the energy of who they are continues.
Yeah. And that's what I got, one of the most moving parts, and it flows throughout, of the Most Cunning Heart, is the color of love, is Caitlin's search for that energy that you're talking about, that color of love. And I can't remember where it is in the novel, but that when she talks about the engraving on the stone that her Nana reluctantly allowed, her Nana reluctantly allowed her father to be buried in. And when she says that label, like wife, husband, is just a label for not even necessarily love, and that she chose to put beloved on the tombstone. I thought that was beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also one of the most heartbreaking parts of the novel, because it feels like throughout she's in this perpetual search for what she had as a child, and yet still questioning what she had as a child. What I want you to talk about the color of love. I want you to talk about where that came from, and where that idea emerged.
Well, if my arm was long enough, I would reach into my study and show you the color of love, because there's a backstory. And if you're a librarian in the audience, please close your ears. Because when I lived in Grimsby, my mother would take me to the public library. And one day, as a little girl, I took out this book, and it was called What Color is Love? And it's beautiful, little hardback. I'm sorry, I can't remember the author right now. If I was Googling, I would get there, but I can see the cover in my head, which is just down in my study. And I loved this book. And it was really about this, talking about imagery and pictures. And so I remember my mother asking me where it was, because it was due. And the little cards back in the day were the library cards that you had. And I didn't know where it was. Or maybe I did know where it was, and I just didn't want to tell her. I'm not quite sure with my memory there. But in either case, I kept it.
Yeah.
And I still have it. And then when I published Quarry, as fate would have it, I was actually reading at the library where I quote took this book, and I'm still borrowing it. I didn't really steal it. And it was so fascinating to me. I have a picture of me holding that book, and then in front of the library. And anyway, so I have this whole history. So the book is called What Color is Love? But for fiction, we called it The Color of Love, right? So it's I think it was just something I was drawn to even as a little girl. So your comments too about going back, about how Caitlin's trying to find her way not only in the future but in the past, and trying to connect that. I think that book really kind of connects in that same way as well. So it wanted to be in the novel, and I was so happy that it wanted to be in the novel, because and to me it's also interesting too. So a question like that just shows there's always a story behind the story as well, which I love. And I think that's an energy field that we can tap into, even if we don't know exactly what that story is. So I think when there's a certain sort of energy of that, I have the honor of being a podcast host, and I share this honor with Jessica Outram, and we do the Hummingbird podcast. It's so interesting because we were actually talking about write what you know, and sort of taking that rule and playing with it and so on. And I think that episode will come out next Sunday, I believe, because all rules are there for a reason, but it doesn't mean they have to be followed.
Yeah.
So it's like finding your way as a creator, but they can also be helpful because they allow you to sort of have some kind of marker. But yeah, and so interesting the way fiction and then the real, that blend, because when you said colors, I was thinking, oh, Colors Love is the name of the book, and I thought, no, it's actually What Colors Love. So I had to make that distinction in my head, which is so interesting when I think about how memory works and how what we read can seem so vivid, and that can almost be like a memory, even though it hasn't happened to us, because of the vivid quality of being in the imagination when we're reading. And the way that feelings then can be part of our reading experience, because we're engaged in what's happening and feeling those things. And I think that's such a gift of what we can get, not only as creators of the art of writing, but also as readers, and to help us empathize and to feel.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that book exists, that moment in Caitlin's story is from real life, because normally I Google every little thing in books that I read, and I'm glad that I got to hear you say it as opposed to discovering it. Kaylee's just put What Color is Love in the chat by Joan Walsh Angler,
Yes,
maybe.
thank you. That's it. Yeah.
And also a link to Catherine's podcast. Highly recommend
Thank you.
that
Thank
you
you.
listen in on that.
Thank you.
You mentioned being in Ireland and going to school, and a interesting part of the Most Cunning Heart is the poetry, specifically in academia, which at times made me laugh, because I find that competition and envy and all that kind of stuff sort of ridiculous, but also undeniable. I mean, to say that any writer hasn't felt just a tad bit of envy at some point in their lives is strange. But I wanted to talk to you about that, and about some of the characters who, and you don't have to say whether they're real or not, but some of the characters in The Most Cunning Heart. It's so great. But what are your thoughts on that, and how, like, just envy in general?
Envy, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's unfortunate that there's so much about how our world operates that it's a hierarchy. So there's always what's better, what's best, and who's the best then, right? So, and then I think even in the family unit, a sibling might even think that their other sibling is the favorite, or I mean, and a lot of it's just perception and things that we have to work out, I think, as individuals. And I think because there is a lot of insecurity in learning the craft of something, and with art in particular, that sense of it's not like 2 + 2 = 4 and there's your check mark. So there's that sort of aesthetic of what follows someone else's aesthetic, what pleases that person. So when you get into that arena of some teachers too, I know I've seen this in operation, will have sort of a bias towards other students who are more like them. And that sort of gets reinforced and they become the favorite. And then say another student who's maybe doing something different and not lesser than the others that are, but not getting that recognition. And there can be a lot of difficult emotions that come with that, I think, when there's that sort of realm of who's getting the spotlight and who isn't, and dealing with those emotions of am I not good enough, and what's wrong with me, and I want that now. Or maybe not, maybe the person's like, I don't want that, that's not what I want to do, and I'm going to be the artist I want to be. I mean, that can be the push point away, and the strength that the artist needs to find their own way, because there's so much of what you have to figure out internally, and I find that never goes away. And so it's an ongoing struggle in many ways as well, to sort of find your way as you're moving through whatever it is that you're working on. Yeah.
And a big aspect of that envy is tied to the emotionally abusive relationship between Andy and Caitlin. One of my favorite moments is when Andy misses a poetry reading, and some up and coming poet comes in, and I can't remember what she says about it, but basically like he's going to lose his mind when he discovers that this nobody of a poet has taken his place, or something along those lines. The emotional abuse is hard to read at times, because I felt just throughout this, like I was rooting for her. I wanted her so desperately to see Andy for who he was, to see him as early as we did as readers. And that I want to talk about that, how, because you didn't go very, there wasn't as much violence or cringe, I guess, as there could be. And I wanted to understand how you found your balance with that.
Yeah. You know what? The story
Difficult to
seems,
write.
what's that?
It's difficult to write.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, it's interesting too, because, um, you know, there's just like hierarchies of anything, there's hierarchies of abuse. And in terms of what someone experiences. And in Caitlin's world, she knows that her mother had experienced physical abuse. So we have some kind of physical marker to tell us that.
Yeah.
And then you have something that's called emotional abuse, which has no physical marker in that same way, but actually it is quite physical, and it goes to the body and it goes to a person's behavior. And so I wanted to explore that in the way that that is so, again, obvious to the people outside of it, which would be in this case the reader, but the person in it can't see it. And it's a very common sort of experience, and some people may know and unfortunately have to watch that in a loved one. It's painful, but there are so many factors going on in that dynamic that it's hard to pinpoint as well. And because it's such a subtle thing, it doesn't happen overnight. And because of someone's sense of love and trust and living in a sort of way that isn't being reinforced, there's a total dismantling that has to happen. And until someone is sort of ready, you can deny a lot, and you can live through a lot, and frankly be quite resilient.
Yeah.
And I think, if anything too, I wanted to explore that because I often hear, and it's disheartening to see how much abuse is out there, particularly towards women, but not just women, and to see how that suffering happens, and how there's often that judgment of blaming the victim, and she should just get out of that relationship, or why doesn't she just do that? And I wanted to, I guess in some way, I guess when I think about this conversation, Alison, push the reader to see how this can happen. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the reader's gonna want to keep reading. And I was kind of okay with that, because I thought this book has to be written. I think this, and I wanted it to be the kind of emotional abuse where it was working on all the levels, but not an explosive life total threatening way, although it leads up to that in some way. But I wanted it to be, because it is like a force field, and isolation is a big part of what abusers do to the person that they're abusing. And someone who's in grief already is dealing with so much, let alone all of those things. So it's almost like it's a predator prey kind of thing.
Yeah.
And which is scary. And when a person doesn't have any sort of parental guidance in their life anymore, or anyone really, she's on her own there, and that need to belong. I mean, when I think about, I did a psych degree, and I think about the many listeners might know about this study with rhesus monkeys, and how it's terrible when I think about what they do with animals and experience. But anyway, rhesus monkeys, they were little babies, and they were put in a cage, and the cage was with a mother that was also a cage. so it wasn't a real mother, but it would have food so they could go and have food. And then
Right.
they had another cage where, if I remember it correctly, there was another mother, but this wasn't just wires, it had fur and so on, but it didn't have food. And the little rhesus monkeys would go to the one that had the fur and the comfort,
Oh,
even though the other one had food. And I
right.
think that that says so much about the heart, our needs, the way that that is so primal
Mhm.
and so painful when
Yeah.
someone takes advantage of that. It's particularly when someone's in a vulnerable position. And I think if I were to think about Andy, I would say there were narcissistic tendencies there. I don't know if that character actually is narcissistic personality, but I would say, I mean, that's for the reader to decide. I'm just working with strands in such a way, but yeah. Does that
Yeah.
answer your question?
I know. And it does, and then some. And that,
Yeah.
and this is not a spoiler in any way, because we discover early on he's married, he's got 2 children,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
she gets involved, and she asks herself at one point, she's like, there must be a reason why I'm getting involved with a married man.
Yeah.
And that's almost a question that Andy knows the answer to, right? He knows, you're getting involved with me because you're desperate, because not, and I'm not saying that to
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
getting involved with,
Mhm.
like, that's not
Yeah.
an indictment.
Mhm.
It's that she's desperately in need of love, right? In search of it, and it presents itself, and she grabs it, and regardless of what the circumstances are, she just takes it. And that moment was touching, because she's blaming herself, and it's like the beginning of her journey of blaming herself. And that, I thought you did that so well, Andy, and Caitlin's relationship is just spot on with her emotional discovery. I'm
Thank
going to ask one more question. If
you.
anyone has
Mhm.
any questions, please
Sure.
put them in the chat. Um, you touched upon this earlier, the idea of this book, The Most Cunning Heart, existing on its own, away from Corey.
Mhm.
Um, and they do. I think that's the miracle of some of the best sequels, if you want to, if you're comfortable calling it a sequel.
I'm
Um,
happy, whatever. If people are reading
yeah,
it, that's all that matters. You can call it whatever.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so my question was, when you finished Quarry, did you know there was a future for Caitlin? Or when you sat down to write The Most Cunning Heart, did you know that it was Caitlin's story? Like, when did that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know if I could actually say now, because again, it feels that everything's been so organic, as I alluded to earlier. So I felt that I don't even they were working on so many sort of gaps in between, and I think it was just an ongoing sort of continuation, not necessarily a really top down way of thinking about it. I think it was just sort of the continuation of Caitlin's world. So
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
And so it began with The Most Cunning Heart. It wasn't something that you thought when you finished Quarry that you needed to go, you needed to follow her to Ireland. And
Well, I think I did. Like, I think I finished Quarry, and then I just wanted to keep going and continuing the story because there was more. There was more I
yeah,
wanted to explore. And also was interested too when, I mean, grief is one thing and loss, and much of Caitlin's story is directly connected to those events happening and coming of age and all of those things. And I was interested in what's the aftermath of somebody dealing with grief and the effect of that in the world. And so that was kind of like exploring that. So not, it was sort of the undercurrent of the second novel versus it was the sort of direct current of the first novel, if that makes sense. So I was interested in the dynamic just in different ways.
right. And I asked that question, not in my mind, I imagined there was like a span of 2 years before you sat down and started writing The Most Cunning Heart. I wasn't thinking in my head that you sat down and immediately started this novel, which is also important, I think, to understand the emotional quality of both of the stories.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I just have a silly question about symbolism, but
Sure.
we have questions in the audience, Kaylee.
Yes, we have a question from Susan. Susan would also like to note that her mom's mother is from Larne, daughter of a fisher who lived on the sea and came to Canada and married a farmer in Colpoys Bay, not far from Owen Sound. So just wanted to give that little
Oh, I
shout
love
out.
that. Love that. Yay, Owen
Um,
Sound.
and Susan has a question tied into there too. The question is, how did it inform your theme to have the story set in Ireland? Or could the story have been set anywhere outside of the main character's home country and essentially she'd have undergone a similar experience?
Mhm. That's a really good question. And there's so many connections to Caitlin's journey. I mean, there's the place and in Ireland, Northern Ireland, poets are revered. And because it's her love of poetry, it's almost like, and also then the sense of her Celtic heritage. And I could see it being in Scotland as well too, like some kind of Celtic country. Yeah, I guess in some way you're not even thinking about which country should it be. You're just sort of following your instinct and your intuition, which I often do when I'm writing. So I can't imagine another place, but maybe Scotland. Yeah.
That would be amazing. That's my favorite place on earth. That's okay. That's the only one. Unless other questions pop up, I'm going to finish because I know in poetry, there's so much symbolism and there's so much meaning behind word choices and language choices. But I wanted to talk about one of Andy's daughters. He's got two daughters. And Grace, there's a paragraph where Caitlin is describing her as looking nothing like Andy or his wife, Mira, but looking like her. And I thought, at first, when I first read that section, I thought, okay, this is going to come back in some way. This is going to, tie into Caitlin's life in some way. And I wanted to talk to you about that. Was that a choice, or was that something that just, as you say, just kind of?
Well, thinking about some of the conversations that we've had and the strands that have come up, her sense of connecting to the past, I think, and is also evident in this particular character. And I think too that sense of wanting to connect, and the visual way that she does to see herself as well. So I think those things are probably working on her and her experience of feeling some kind of connection to the past in another person that resembles who she would have been and at that particular age. So like the layers again of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was nice that there's a moment in the book where she recognizes that Grace is turning into a young woman, is kind of, growing into herself, and she alone, Grace is a great character. The scene at the piano when she's playing chopsticks first thing in the morning, I thought was such a great little moment. That's all I have to ask about The Most Cunning Heart, but I do have a question about what you're working on now, and if you're willing to share with everybody what we can look forward to.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the poetry's wanted some attention, and I'm honored and happy to share that I have a book coming out next spring. And it's a long title, but it's also a new and selected. So the title is Put Flowers Around Us and Pretend We're Dead, New and Selected Poems. And I'm in the process now. It's interesting because I don't normally go back to my other poetry books, maybe for readings and so on. So this was like, I was telling one of my cousins about it, and she was trying to wrap her head around it. And she's like, is it like a greatest hits then or some kind? Like, she loves music. And I'm like, yeah, it's kind of like the greatest hits of your favorite band or something, right, over the years, right? So so it's been interesting working with Paul Ramir. She's been my poetry editor, and I cherish that relationship with Paul. And so we're putting that together, and so there'll be poems from my various collections and then some new ones as well too, and that will come out in spring with Will Second Win.
That's awesome. Yeah, Paul is incredible. I am so excited to for that to come. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure, really, really, and truly a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Allison, and thanks to all of you for joining us. It's been lovely, but I've had to sort of block you out because then I'll get distracted and think, who's there? And I want to talk to them. No. I'm like, I'm focused here on this.
I know sometimes it's hard when I mean, I love looking up at people, but sometimes it's hard when the same thing, I want to, kind of refer to somebody up there. But I am thrilled that Palimpsest has given us 2 copies of
great
Heart to raffle off. And so drum roll, Kaylee is going to raffle off one and then the other.
All right, it's always my favorite part. All right, our first winner for today is Stephanie Thabar. The last names are always the really tricky part, but Stephanie Thabar, the first winner.
Yay!
And our second winner for today is Elwinda Wiggins.
Yay! That's congratulations for winning. If you have already read The Most Cunning Heart, or if you would like to gift it to somebody else, send me an email. Or if you want to gift it, whatever, send me an email to junctionwrites@gmail.com with the name and address of where you would like it mailed. And I'll contact Palimpsest and they'll get that off to you as soon as possible. Hopefully you'll get it in time before Christmas. And that is it. You can find out more about Catherine at catherinegraham.com. And again, we mentioned the Hummingbird podcast. I will include all of that in the YouTube video that will get posted in the next few days. And that's it. That's all. Thank
you, everybody. Thank you so much. Lovely to have you here.
I appreciate everybody coming and joining us today. And Catherine, thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks, Allison.
Thanks, Kaylee. See everybody soon.